কিশোর ভারতী ভগিনী নিবেদিতা কলেজের ইতিহাস ও দর্শন বিভাগ এবং আইকিউএসির দ্বারা আয়োজিত আজকের জাতীয় আলোচনা সভা যা অন্তর্জালের মাধ্যমে অনুষ্ঠিত হচ্ছে সেখানে সবাইকে আমি স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি। আমাদের আজকের আলোচনার বিষয় হিন্দু social and religious reform movements, a critical reappraisal. আমি মাননীয় অধ্যক্ষ মহাশয় ডক্টর শিবশঙ্কর সানাকে অনুরোধ করছি এই বিষয়ে তার মূল্যবান মতামত প্রদানের জন্য। স্যার যদি জয়েন করে থাকেন তাহলে আমি স্যারকে অনুরোধ করছি এই বিষয়ে তার মূল্যবান মতামত প্রদানের জন্য। ডাক্তার শিবশঙ্কর সানা মহাশয়কে আমি অনুরোধ করছি।
হ্যালো, স্ক্রিনে দেখো তো। হ্যালো,
কিশোর ভারতী ভগিনী নিবেদিতা কলেজের ইতিহাস ও দর্শন বিভাগ এবং আইকিউএসির দ্বারা আয়োজিত আজকের জাতীয় আলোচনা সভা যা অন্তর্জালের মাধ্যমে অনুষ্ঠিত হচ্ছে
হ্যালো,
সেখানে স্যার আপনাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে, সেখানে সবাইকে স্বাগত জানানো হচ্ছে। আমাদের আজকের আলোচ্য বিষয় হিন্দু সোশ্যাল অ্যান্ড রিলিজিয়াস রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টস, এ ক্রিটিক্যাল রিএপ্রেজাল। আমি প্রথমেই আমাদের মাননীয় অধ্যক্ষ ডক্টর শিবশঙ্কর সানা মহাশয়কে অনুরোধ করছি এই বিষয়ে তার মূল্যবান মতামত প্রদানের জন্য। আমি পুনরায় অনুরোধ করছি মাননীয়
হ্যালো
অধ্যক্ষ ডক্টর
হ্যালো
আপনাকে স্যার শোনা যাচ্ছে। স্যার আপনাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে। আপনি হেডফোনটা স্যার কানে দিন, আমি শুনতে পারবেন।
হ্যালো
স্যার আপনাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে।
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে, এবার ঠিক আছে। আমার কথা শুনতে
কিশোর
পাচ্ছ?
ভারতী, হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে স্যার।
ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে।
কিশোর ভারতী ভগিনী নিবেদিতা কলেজের ইতিহাস ও দর্শন বিভাগ এবং আইকিউএসির দ্বারা আয়োজিত আজকের জাতীয় আলোচনা সভা, যা অন্তর্জালের মাধ্যমে অনুষ্ঠিত হচ্ছে, সেখানে সবাইকে স্বাগত জানানো হচ্ছে। আমাদের আজকের আলোচ্য বিষয় হিন্দু সোশ্যাল অ্যান্ড রিলিজিয়াস রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টস, এ ক্রিটিক্যাল রিঅ্যাপ্রেজাল। আমি প্রথমেই আমাদের কলেজের মাননীয় অধ্যক্ষ ডক্টর শিবশঙ্কর সানা মহাশয়কে অনুরোধ করছি এই বিষয়ে তার মূল্যবান মতামত প্রদানের জন্য।
থ্যাংক ইউ Namramita. Good
ধন্যবাদ
afternoon
স্যার।
everyone. Honorable Speaker Dr. Amiya Prosad Sen, former professor in history of Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi. Dear colleagues and research scholars, my dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure in welcoming all to this webinar on Hindu social and religious reform movements, a critical reappraisal, organized by Department of History and Department of Philosophy, and in collaboration with internal quality assurance cells of Kishore Bharati Bhagini Nivedita College. I would like to express my sincerest thanks to Dr. Sutopa Mukhopadhyay, Head Department of um, History, and Head of the Department Dr. Ranjini Basu, Department of Philosophy, and our IQAC coordinator, Professor Mohananda Roy, and other organizing members, Professor Namramita Bhuiya, and Professor Mehebub. I believe the whole world is one family. There is one heart, one thought, one God, one goal. The main objectives of every religion are given in a sloka. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya, Tamoso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrittur Ma Mritangamaya, Om Shanti, Om Shanti, Om Shanti. Hey Lord, leads us from ignorance to knowledge. Hey Lord, leads us from darkness to bright. Hey Lord, leads us from mortality to immortality. However, whether you utter the name Ram, Allah, Jesus, Buddha, Guru Nanak, Zoroaster, other god or goddess, it is all the same. If we look back to the history, almost all religious community have faced several religious reform movements in many times. As a result, Hindu religion is not exception. It has a big history in movements. Indeed, despite their differing political and religious views, almost every leader has used the phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam to convey varying concepts and address different issues at different times. We shall learn on this topic from the lecture of our renowned speaker. I am sure you all will feel enriched with knowledge after completion this webinar. I welcome you all once again to the webinar and hope you all will have a great time ahead. I hope today's webinar will achieve a grand success. Thank you everybody. I also wish happy Mahalaya and the coming Sarodaya Utsav Durga Puja festival. Thank you. Thank you, Namramita.
Again, thank you, sir. এরপর আমি আইকিউএসসির কোঅর্ডিনেটর অধ্যাপক মহানন্দ রায় স্যারকে অনুরোধ করছি উনি যদি উপস্থিত হয়ে থাকেন তাহলে তার বক্তব্য প্রদানের জন্য। অধ্যাপক মহানন্দ রায় স্যারকে অনুরোধ করছি, স্যার আপনি।
হ্যালো, am I audible?
হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে। Yes, you are audible. স্যার শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I stand there for you today with a heart full of gratitude and appreciation on behalf of KBBNC as the IQAC coordinator. We have gathered here for a profoundly enlightening seminar on the topic Hindu social and religious reform movements, a critical reappraisal. And I am deeply honored to extend my warmest thanks to all of you for joining us today. Before I proceed, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed principal, Dr. Shib Shana. Dr. Shana's visionary leadership and unwavering support, we have been instrumental in making this event a reality. His dedication to promotion academic excellence and fostering an environment of critical thinking is truly commendable. We are fortunate to have him as our guidance force. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Amiya Prosad. It is an immense privilege to have someone of his caliber share his expertise with us today. His presence has added immense value to our seminar, and we are eagerly anticipating the knowledge he will impact during his presentation. I must also acknowledge the hard work and dedication of our organizing committee, faculty members of philosophy and history department who have tirelessly worked behind the scene to make this seminar a success. Their collective efforts from logistical arrangement to promoting the event have been outstanding. It is heartening to see such diverse audience representation a wide spectrum of academia gather to delve into this important subject. Your presence today highlights the significance of the topic and the value of academic resource in understanding the intricacies of social and religious reform movements. As we delve into the critical reprisal of Hindu social and religious reform movements, let us remember the importance of open dialogue, respectful debate, and the pursuit of the knowledge. It is through events like this that we can collectively explore different perspectives, challenge our own preconception, and deepen our understanding of the world around us. I encourage you all to actively engage in the discussion and take away valuable insights from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Amiya Prosad. Once again, thank you all for being a part of this seminar. Your presence makes this event meaningful, and we look forward to a day of insightful discussion and academic enlightenment. Let us now commence our seminar with enthusiasm, open mind, and a commitment to forthcoming knowledge. Thank you. Thank you.
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার ফর ইয়োর স্পিচ। এরপর আমি আমাদের আজকের যেটা মুখ্য আকর্ষণ ডক্টর অমিয় প্রসাদ সেনের মূল্যবান বক্তব্য শুনবো। স্যারকে আমি অনুরোধ করব, কিন্তু আমি স্যার সম্পর্কে একটু শর্ট ইন্ট্রোডাকশন দিতে চাইছি। ডক্টর অমিয় প্রসাদ সেন একজন বিখ্যাত ঐতিহাসিক। তার আগ্রহের জায়গা কালচারাল হিস্ট্রি অফ মডার্ন ইন্ডিয়া। তিনি অক্সফোর্ড হিন্দু স্টাডিজ এর শিবদাসানী ফেলো। তিনি জামিয়া মিলিয়া ইসলামিয়ার বিখ্যাত কলেজে নিউ দিল্লির প্রাক্তন অধ্যাপক। স্যার, আপনাকে আমি অনুরোধ করছি আপনার বক্তব্য পরিবেশনের জন্য।
Thank you. Respected principal, distinguished members of the faculty, dear students, thank you for giving me an opportunity to be here and speak to you. It is always nice to be among students and fellow teachers. বাংলায় বলতে পারলে ভালো হতো, কিন্তু প্রবাসী বাঙালি হিসেবে আমি ঠিক একাডেমিক বাংলাতে রপ্ত নই। মানে রান্নাঘরের বাংলায় বলা যায়, সহজে বাজার হাটে বলা যায়, কিন্তু একাডেমিক বাংলা বলতে হলে যে নিষ্ঠা এবং যে জ্ঞান দরকার সেটা আমার এখনো হয়ে ওঠেনি। অতএব আমি খুব সরল ইংরেজিতে আমার যা বলা সেটুকুন বলবো। আপনারা সহজেই এবং কোনো অসুবিধা না হয়ে আপনারা লেকচারের শেষে প্রশ্ন বাংলাতে করতে পারেন, তার যথাযথ উত্তর আমি দেব। Okay, so having said that, let me begin by making an important point regarding the teaching of history and its understanding. First of all, we fail to distinguish sometimes, this has been my experience, we fail to distinguish between fact and interpretation, fact and theory. মানে আমাদের সিলেবাসে, আমাদের কারিকুলামে there are lots of facts given in textbooks. রামমোহন রয় কবে জন্ম হলো, কবে মৃত্যু হলো, সতী প্রথার নিবারণ কবে হলো, ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। But behind those facts there must be some meaning. I mean, the Taj Mahal exists, it's a fact. But unless there is meaning put to that existence, it really has no relevance. So it's the importance of interpreting a fact and constructing a theory, looking at those facts, which really matters. What I'm going to do today is not something which will resemble your textbooks. Whatever you have read in your textbooks, forget it, because I'm going to present this in a very different manner. And the reason for that is that I want you to think. A teacher's task is to make the student think. And a teacher's task is also to make him or herself think. So I'm taking this opportunity to look at a subject which is very common and very popular in history syllabuses, but it is rarely looked upon critically. We just mug up facts and we deal off facts, and that is it to it. But that is not what I'm going to do today. So let me begin by first asking the question, and this is a fundamental question: why study social and religious reform movements of the Hindus first? That's the first question. I think I can think of two broad reasons. First of all, let me, and I'm going to perhaps surprise you here to an extent, by saying that there really was no Hinduism as such before the 18th century. There was a religion which Hindus practiced, but there was a lot of difference and diversity in that religion. There were Vaishnavas, and there were Shaktas, and there were Shaivas, and there were Ganapatyas, and all kinds of people. There was folk religion too. So there was really no unified religion of the Hindus, which you could have called Hinduism before the 18th century. Let me, as a matter of fact, tell you that it is in the 1780s, that is the late 18th century, that English people, and I can also name the person, This man was called Charles Grant, and he was an official of the East India Company. Charles Grant first used the term Hinduism to describe the religion of the Hindus. And behind doing that, his intention was to somehow suggest that all Hindus followed the same religion. Because in Christianity and in Islam, that is the supposition that all Muslims will follow Islam and all Christians will follow Christianity. That was not really the case with Hinduism. But before that, let me also add to this Charles Grant fact. The first Indian to use the word Hinduism was Ram Mohan Roy in 1816, 1816. So you can see that as far as an Indian is concerned, the word Hinduism did not really exist. It began to be used in the early 19th century, and ever since then, it has been used very, very commonly. As a historian, as a student of history, one must understand this and appreciate it, because we often suppose that Hinduism has been existing for God knows how many thousands of years. Of course, there was a religion that Hindus followed, but they did not have the term Hinduism attached to it. This is a very modern term. Why do I say that there is a bit of complexity in Hinduism? It is different from Islam and Christianity in one sense. The difference lies in the following. Traditionally, and this was true until the 19th century, after 19th century, as I shall try and argue, a lot of changes happened to the religion of the Hindus. Traditionally, Hinduism was not an orthodoxy, but an orthopraxy. Let me explain these terms for the sake of students who may not understand them. Orthodoxy is an attitude which believes in following or remaining faithful to a particular kind of attitude or practice or belief. Orthopraxy is something different. I am saying that Hinduism was not an orthodoxy in the sense that until the 19th century, it did not really matter which god you followed. No Hindu ever insisted that everyone must follow the same god or goddess. This is true even today. A typical Hindu, when he goes to a temple, he or she starts worshipping all kinds of gods and goddesses. It is also a fact that even if you are an atheist, you don't believe in God, Nastik holeo, you still remain a Hindu. No one will call you a non-Hindu if you say that I don't believe in God. Because even Nastikota, atheism, is included within the Hindu worldview. And this is remarkable because this does not apply to either Islam or Christianity. Now, the 19th century reform movements, which I'm going to be speaking about, changed all that in a very significant way. Because, as I shall presently argue, they began to emerge after Ram Mohan something like a unified religion of all Hindus, which was called Hinduism. So you look up the literature of pre-modern India, medieval India, you will never find the word Hinduism. You may find the word Hindu here and there, but not Hinduism. More interesting is the fact that even the word Hindu, as you should know, is non-Indian in origin and non-Hindu in origin. It was first used by the ancient Persians and Greeks for people living on the eastern bank of the river Indus. In fact, the word Hindu is a distortion of the word Sindhu, which is the river Indus. So the original use of the word Hindu was actually meant to describe people, ethnic people, a kind of people, communities living on the eastern bank of the Indus. It did not mean a religion. As I said, there was no Hinduism. And the word Hindu, in fact, did not convey the sense of a religion until about the late 18th or early 19th century. This is something that you must understand. It is because of this origin that some people object to the word Hinduism, even today. In the 19th century, as you would have heard, there was a movement called the Arya Samaj, begun by Dayanand Saraswati in the Punjab. The Arya Samajis did not use the word Hinduism. They used the word Arya Dharma, which means the path of the noble path. And the objection behind not using the word Hinduism is precisely because it had a foreign origin. Even today, there are people belonging to the Hindu right, the Hindutva lobby as it's called, object to the use of the word Hinduism, saying that this is not an Indian word at all. It originates in a non-Indian culture. Okay, this is something that you must understand at the outset. And it is not something, I said all this because this is not something you will easily encounter or easily find in any textbook of yours. মানে পাঠ্যপুস্তক এটা পাবেন না এই কথাটার উল্লেখ যে হিন্দু ধর্ম শব্দটা ঊনবিংশ শতাব্দীর প্রথম দিকে প্রথম ব্যবহার হতে আরম্ভ হয়। My second point, the reason for studying Hindu social and religious reform movements in particular is because contemporary Hinduism, Ajkar Hindu Dharma, is much closer to 19th century Hinduism than it is to Vedic Hinduism. Why am I saying that? কেন বলছি? এই জন্য বলছি যে সাধারণত there is this belief that the origin of Hinduism lies in the Vedas. Sadly, I think about 99% of Hindus don't know what the Vedas say. They just take this for granted that Hinduism originates in the Vedas. Even people who know Sanskrit will not be able to read the Vedas because the Vedas were written in a very archaic, a very old form of Sanskrit. It's not the Sanskrit which you learn in schools and colleges. It needs special skills to understand or even read that kind of Sanskrit. But my major point is this. If the source of Hinduism lies in the Vedas, do we worship any Vedic god and goddess now? I don't think so. Is there any temple in all of India dedicated to the Lord Indra, who was the lord of the gods, or say Ushas, again a Vedic goddess, or Agni, or Pavan, or Varuna? These are all Vedic deities, Vedic gods and goddesses. But there are no temples today in their honor. Instead, Hindus today worship gods and goddesses which evolved and came into existence much later. So the Hinduism of today is only nominally or even only symbolically rooted in the Vedas, not historically. All religions have changed and they have the tendency to change. Hinduism too has evolved. And as I said, what we practice today as Hinduism was really formed in the 19th century. And contemporary Hinduism, the Hinduism of today, Ajkar Hindu Dharma, is much closer to what happened during the 19th century. And I'll try and demonstrate and prove why I say this. Now, my second segment is about the term reform itself. Now, in Bangla, this is called Sanskar. In Hindi, it is called Sudhar. In Marathi, it is called Sanskarin. The interesting point here is this, that if you look up medieval or ancient Indian literature, Indian languages, even Sanskrit, you will not find any equivalent of the term reform. The word Sanskar is nowhere there in pre-modern Bangla, in medieval Bangla or early Bangla. It is essentially a modern 19th century term. This is not to say that there was no intention of reforming or changing society. There was always the change, the need to reform society. If the word reform suggests changing for the better, সমাজকে সংশোধন করা যদি উদ্দেশ্য হয়ে থাকে সেটা বরাবরই ছিল. It was there in the time of Buddha, it was there in the time of Kabir, Nanak, etc., etc. But the interesting fact is this, যে কবির নানকের সমসাময়িকরা কিন্তু এদেরকে রিফর্মার বা সুধারক বলে ডাকেনি কখনো, and their work was not called reform. Show me any textbook or any book for that matter belonging to the pre-modern age, say 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, which calls Kabir a reformer, or Chaitanya a reformer, or the Buddha a reformer. The fact that I'm trying to say is this, that we began to use the word reformer or Sanskarak for these people only in the 19th century. So this is a very modern concept and a very modern usage. This one must understand. It was not there all the time. As I said, we should not mix up the two. There was always the intention to change society, improve society, and so on, but that was not described as reform. This is the important point. There was something unique, something new about the use of the word reform and its use, which I shall try and explain in the next few minutes. Second, the word reform is associated with the term modernity. আধুনিকতার সঙ্গে সমাজ সংস্কার আন্দোলন বা ধর্মীয় সংস্কার আন্দোলনে খুবই ঘনিষ্ঠ যোগাযোগ আছে, কারণ এই সংস্কার আন্দোলনগুলোতে উদ্দেশ্য কিন্তু বেসিক্যালি ছিল মডার্নিটিকে আনা, আধুনিকতাকে আনা, আধুনিক হওয়া, নিজেদের আধুনিক করা। অতএব এই জিনিসটা আমাদের বুঝতে হবে যে আধুনিক হতে গেলে সমাজ এবং ধর্মকে বদলাতে হবে, পরিবর্তন করতে হবে একটা নির্দিষ্ট পথে। থার্ড, একটি ইতিহাসের ছাত্রর পক্ষে এটা খুব স্বাভাবিক প্রশ্ন, ন্যাচুরাল কোয়েশ্চেন, যে ঊনবিংশ শতাব্দীতে এসেই এই রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টগুলো কেন দেখা যায়, এর আগে কেন হয় না? মানে আমরা কি বলতে পারি যে 16th সেঞ্চুরিতে এরকমই একটা রিফর্ম মুভমেন্ট চলেছিল? হ্যাঁ, অনেকে বলবেন যে ভক্তি আন্দোলন তো ছিল 16th সেঞ্চুরিতে, উত্তর ভারতে এবং দক্ষিণ ভারতে অনেক জায়গায় ভক্তি আন্দোলনের মারফতে অনেক পরিবর্তন এসেছিল। জাতিবাদের বিরুদ্ধে প্রচার হয়েছিল, জাতিবাদের বিরুদ্ধে অনেক লেখালেখি বলা হয়েছিল, আমাদের সন্তরা এই বিষয়ে অনেক কিছু বলেছেন, লিখেছেন, কিন্তু তবুও এগুলোকে রিফর্ম মুভমেন্ট বলা যায় না। তার অনেক কারণ আছে। তো যদি এইটা ধরে নেওয়া যায়, if it is assumed that 19th century was the time when the reform movement came or originated, it is because of the fact that in the 19th century, India and England were very closely associated intellectually, socially, and politically. What I'm trying to say is it because of the impact of the West, the coming of British rule in India, that this movement originated? Is it because of a clash of cultures, a clash of civilizations? দুটো সভ্যতার পরস্পরের মধ্যে মেলামেশার কারণেই কি এটা জন্ম নিয়েছে? If that is the question, then there is a further question, which is this: if the coming together of two cultures can produce a renaissance, a নবজাগরণ বা social reform movement যদি জন্ম দেয়, why did this not occur in the Muslim period, in the Muslim rule? As I said, there was no such movement. We don't know of any social and religious reform movement in pre-modern India. So this is a question that one must be asking and trying to resolve as to why before the 19th century, under the Muslim rulers, there was no comparable reform movement. I will, in answering this question, an important question, I'll first make the point, and this is an observation that you must, again, not something that your textbooks will tell you, পাঠ্যপুস্তক বলবে না এই কথাগুলো। প্রথম কথা, in pre-modern reform movements, there was really no association of the state. The ruling class and the state were not really involved. I am aware of the fact that in 1580, Emperor Akbar tried to abolish sati, but he failed. And Thereafter, I have not heard of any Mughal emperor or any other Muslim ruler trying to introduce such changes in Hindu society. Now, under British rule, there was the same attitude in the sense that the British initially, at the beginning, did not want to intervene in Hindu society. Until 1813, you should know, 1813, until 1813, the British government did not allow European missionaries to enter India for the sake of preaching. It is because of this reason that missionaries went and settled in Srirampur, which we now know as a major Christian cultural center. That is where the missionaries like Carey, Marshman, and Ward came and settled. This was a Danish colony, it was not a British colony, which is why the missionaries could go and settle there. So this is important. Even the British rule initially did not want to intervene in the matter of the religious and social life of the Hindus. But that attitude changed considerably because in 1829, you find the British government in India abolishing sati by law. In 1856, it enabled Hindu widows to marry. So after a point, British rulers began to indeed intervene in the working of Hindu society and religion. Now, having said that, let us try and understand the basic differences between Indo-Muslim rule and British rule in respect of this kind of reform question. First of all, and this is again an interesting and important point, the Muslims believed in conversion of faith, not of thought. মানে মুসলমানরা আমাদের হিন্দুদের বা অমুসলিমদের বিচারধারাকে পরিবর্তন করার চেষ্টা করেননি, ওরা শুধু ধর্মীয় পরিবর্তন চেয়েছেন। ওরা চেয়েছেন যে সবাই মুসলমান হয়ে যাক, সেটা কিছুটা হয়তো সাকসেসফুলও হয়েছিল, বাট দিস ইজ ভেরি ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রম হোয়াট দ্য ব্রিটিশ ডিড, অ্যান্ড এটা আমি একটু আন্ডারলাইন করতে চাই। The British did the opposite. They believed that by changing thought, changing the way you think, that you could change the faith also. In other words, এরা কি বলছেন? এরা বলছেন যে মানুষের বিচারধারা, যুক্তিবাদ এবং ইত্যাদি অন্যান্য আধুনিক জিনিস মানুষের মস্তিষ্কে প্রবেশ করলে তার ধর্মীয় বিচারধারাও পাল্টাতে পারে। মানে প্রথমে ধর্মকে না বদলে they try to change the attitude, they try to change the understanding of something. বৌদ্ধিক বিকাশের উপর জোর দেওয়া হয়েছিল ব্রিটিশ রুলে, এবং তাদের বিশ্বাস ছিল, and I think they were quite right in understanding that intellectual changes will produce religious changes. আপনারা সবাই ইয়াং বেঙ্গলের কথা শুনেছেন, ইয়াং বেঙ্গল ডেরোজিয়ান যাদের বলা হয়, হিন্দু কলেজের প্রথম ছাত্র। এদের মধ্যে কিছু লোক খ্রিস্টান হয়ে গিয়েছিলেন, যেমন কৃষ্ণমোহন বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়। কৃষ্ণমোহন বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় changed to Christianity not because he necessarily found Christianity better than Hinduism. He changed Christianity because he thought that there was much more to learn from the European cultural scenario than the Indian. So you cannot separate European intellectual thought from the impact of Christianity in respect of people who converted. And this is exactly the point I'm trying to say, which is this, that in the case of British, a change in attitude, a change in mental processes changed their religious habits also, and religious thinking also. Second, under Muslim rule, there was very little of secular educational development. By secular, I mean non-religious. The modern schools and other institutions which began to evolve in the 19th century were not there in the pre-19th century. Added to that is the fact that languages like Persian are basically, or rather were basically, a professional language, not an intellectual language. It is not the language in which people thought and wrote about what they felt. It is a language which was used professionally by Hindus and Muslims. Let me explain. About 70 to 80% of revenue officers under the sultans and the Mughals were Hindus who learned Persian. Why did they learn Persian? Because unless you knew Persian, you could not work in revenue offices. That continued until about 1837, when English became the official language. Until 1837, Persian was the language used in Diwani matters, in revenue matters. So you could not have done without the knowledge of Persian, which is why the Hindus learned Persian in a big way. They were very successful in adapting and learning that language. However, the Persian language did not really become the language of intellectual exchange, thought processes. I'm not aware of any Hindus writing in Persian in order to convey some meaningful things which they wanted to say. I think the first person to do that was Ram Mohan Roy in 1804, who wrote Tuhfatul Muayyideen, which was in Persian, had an Arabic introduction. Look at Arabic itself. Arabic was the language of theology, of religion. It was not a secular language. So Hindus who learned Arabic were not able to use it for secular purposes. That, I think, is an important limitation. Contrast that to English. English was never a religious language. It was always, and it was not even a professional language, it was also the language of intellectual exchange. It enabled people to exchange ideas across cultures and across regions. English became the language in which Indians began to understand and write about each other in the 19th century. Imagine before the 19th century, a person from a Hindu from Madras trying to converse with a Hindu from Bengal. It would have been very difficult because neither of them knew the other language. English became, in other words, the vehicle of communication, intellectual communication. It was what is called a lingua franca of the Hindu elite, the Hindu upper classes. It was a language which was used to convey and construct thought processes. More importantly, and this is my third point, Persian and Arabic did not give access to the modern world. The language which gave access to the modern world for the Hindu was English. It is precisely because of this reason that Ram Mohan made a great and consistent effort to learn English, even when he knew only Persian. See, before 1814 or so, Ram Mohan was not very conversant with English. He learned English. He never went to the Hindu college or some English medium school. He learned English the hard way by himself. But why did he learn it? He learned it because he wanted to use it as a window to the world. To learn about the world, only English could have done that, neither Persian nor Arabic. So it is a historical coincidence which must be appreciated, that English became a window to world developments at a time when English was not the leading powers in the world. By the late 18th and early 19th century, England was not only the most powerful nation on earth, but a nation which was able to communicate with other cultures very rapidly and very successfully. I mean, had the French conquered us instead of the English, we would all have been speaking French. This talk of mine would have been in French and not in English. So, English played a major role in creating an educated intelligentsia, an educated class among Hindus, which was at the very basis of the Bengal Renaissance or the Indian awakening in the 19th century. Now, let me come to the next section. And this is important. Again, I'm going to give it to you in points, and these are not points which you will ordinarily find in your textbooks. So please pay attention and একটু মনোযোগ দিয়ে শুনবেন যদি না বুঝতে পারেন তাহলে পরবর্তীকালে কোয়েশ্চেন আনসার সেশনে এটার উত্তর দেওয়া যেতে পারে। As I said, my effort is not to give you facts, which you already know. My effort here is to interpret facts and make you think about new things, how to raise questions and how to resolve them. Number one, I think the reform movement in 19th century began to make an important distinction, and please pay attention here and listen carefully, make a distinction between the word modern and modernity. What I'm trying to say here is this. Modern is something relative to time. Today we are modern in respect to the 19th century. And the word modern also conveys a sense of improvement. I mean, we have technologically advanced over the years. So we use today, as it were, modern technology. So that's how the word modern is used. Modernity, on the other hand, is not simply about improvement. It is about a certain attitude that you take. It is about a certain way of understanding. This is an approach. It is an attitude. It is not simply improvement. All cultures improve. I mean, I'm sure that 16th century technology was an improvement over 13th century technology. But the 16th century did not hear or did not use the word modernity. So there is something more deep-rooted in the term modernity, which one must understand. As I said, it is an entirely different approach rather than merely aiming at technical improvement. The quality of life always improves or generally improves over time, but that is not what I mean by modernity. In the 19th century, people began to understand things differently. That is what I'm trying to emphasize. Number two, again, a point which is not often appreciated, especially those who understand English and are read in English books and textbooks. There is an important distinction again between the words humanism and humanitarianism. I don't know if there is a similar distinction possible in Bangla, because I think for both, the Bangla language would use Manavata Bodh. But in English, the distinction becomes clearer. What is humanism and what is humanitarianism? Let me begin with humanitarianism. Humanitarianism is the approach that shows compassion, karuna, daya, for all forms of life. Maybe it is human being, maybe it is animal. The Buddha in the 6th century BC was speaking of compassion or karuna. That is humanitarianism, feeling for fellow man, to sort of support him and understand his problem, help him in the way that you can, is humanitarianism. If you appreciate the problems of a poor man, this is humanitarianism. If you sympathize with a sick man, that is humanitarianism. Humanism, on the other hand, is different in the sense that it is not simply compassion. It is something different in the sense that humanism is an approach, and I underline this, which believes that everything ought to be man-centered. By man, I don't mean the biological man, I mean the human being. Where everything must be measured in terms of human welfare. What is not useful to human beings is not good. This is the policy behind the term humanism. It is something which began, as you might know, in the 16th century European Renaissance. We always associate humanism with 16th century Italian Renaissance and even Renaissance outside Italy. It evolved there, but it came to India through the British. And it taught Indians and Hindus in particular to make welfare of human beings the basic criteria for judging the quality of a certain thing. This is the philosophy behind utilitarianism, that you must judge a thing by its utility, by its usefulness, for people. Fourth, the reform movement and the intellectual awakening that went with it also brought another important phenomenon in Hindu understanding, in Hindu life. And this is attaching importance to the individual, an individual will. Individual will. What does the individual want? What does a person want? Should he go by what the community says, what everyone says, or should he also exercise his own will? Now, traditionally, again, and I am generalizing here, traditionally, the Hindus were never very self conscious about individuality. I mean, why is it that we still don't know who the author of the Gita was? Who the authors of the 18 Mahapuranas were? They never bothered to put their names on their works. The important thing here is that they do not, or they did not believe in individual identities. They believed in collective identities. So you'll find the name Vedavyas appearing several times in Hindu tradition. Vedavyas was the author of the Mahabharata. Vedavyas was also the author of the 18 Puranas. Now, is that possible? Historically, that's not possible. So Vedavyas is not the name of an individual. It is what is called in French a honorific name, a common name used by many individuals. The important point here is that by not associating your name with a verb, you are also making the statement that individuals don't matter. What they say matters more. Now, this changed in the 19th century because for the first time, Indians started producing biographies in a good number. They started putting their names on what they did and what they worked and what they wrote. So this is establishing one's identity. মানে আমার নিজের যে অস্তিত্ব সেটাকে আমি প্রমাণিত তো করছি, সেটাকে আমি ইতিহাসের জন্য রেখে যাচ্ছি যাতে আমার পরবর্তীকালের লোকেরা আমাকে চিনতে পারে, আমাকে আইডেন্টিফাই করতে পারে যে আমি অমুক সালে অমুক বইটি লিখেছিলাম। এটা কিন্তু this was not a part of traditional Hinduism. Biography writing became very common in the 19th century, and the Hindus adopted it in a very big way. Finally, there is something which we must understand about the motivation behind reform. This is, I think, perhaps the most important point, and again, something which no textbook in West Bengal or anywhere else in India, for that matter, speaks about. No one bothers to ask, why is it that suddenly Hindus started being inspired by the need for reform? Was there an intellectual inspiration? Was there an inspiring idea behind it? I'm trying to answer this question. And by trying to answer this question, I'm also trying to understand why reform movements became important. What I'm about to say now, যেটা আমি এখন বলতে যাচ্ছি, that is the basis of all reform movements. You must make this connection. And what am I trying to say? In the 19th century, there arrived again through British rule an ideology, a set of ideas called deism, D-E-I-S-M. I'm sure you've not heard of it or found it in your textbook, but note it. It's called D-E-I-S-M, deism. Now, what did deism say? It came from Europe, which had evolved this by the 17th century. A lot of European thinkers use the word deism by the 17th century. It came to us by the late 18th and early 19th century, through again, as I said, the British connection. Now, what did deism say? It said something very interesting. It says, look, God made the world, but after he made the world, he forgot all about it. ঈশ্বর সৃষ্টি করেছেন, সৃষ্টি করার পরে উনি বেমালুম ভুলে গেলেন সৃষ্টির কথা, পৃথিবীর কথা। কি করলেন? He left the care of the world to man. জগতের দায়িত্ব জগতের সামাজিক এবং নৈতিক দায়িত্ব মানুষের হাতে ছেড়ে দিলেন। Why? Because it is man who is going to improve the world, not God directly. So this is a new way of saying that man has a moral responsibility, একটা নৈতিক দায়িত্ব থেকে যায় মানুষের পক্ষে, যাতে এরা they make the world a better place, they improve the world. এর এই তাৎপর্যটা, এই আইডিয়াটা একজন ইংলিশ থিঙ্কার পেলি বলে নাম, PALEY, উনি খুব অপূর্ব উপমা দিয়ে বুঝিয়ে চেষ্টা করেছিলেন। কি বললেন যে look, after the watchmaker makes the watch, he forgets all about the watch. মানে যে ঘড়ি বানায়, ঘড়ি বানাবার পর সে ঘড়ি সম্বন্ধে সবকিছু ভুলে যায়। এরপরে ঘড়িকে ঠিক চালানোর দায়িত্ব কার? এই দায়িত্ব আসে যে ঘড়ি পরছেন তার উপর। So it's the wearer of the watch who has to ensure that the watch functions properly, not the manufacturer of the watch. So similarly, after God made the world, he left it to man's care to see to it that the world was a better place. এই যে কথাটি, এটা একটু বোঝার চেষ্টা করবেন। এই কথাটির পিছনে দুটি খুব ডিপ রুটের জিনিস আছে। এক, যে পৃথিবীকে আরো ভালো বানানোর দায়িত্বটা আলটিমেটলি মানুষের, ঈশ্বরের নয়। এবং দ্বিতীয়ত, যে মানুষের হস্তক্ষেপ বিনা, without the intervention of man, and by again man I don't mean just the biological man, but humanity, things will not improve. Man has to consciously, সচেতনভাবে ইন্টারভিন করতে হবে প্রতি স্টেজে, যাতে আমাদের পৃথিবীটা আরো সুন্দর হয়ে ওঠে, আরো ভালো হয়ে ওঠে। এই এতটা গেল রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টের পেছনে যে অনুপ্রেরণা ছিল, ইন্সপিরেশন ছিল, সেই সম্বন্ধে। এবার রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টের সম্বন্ধে আসি। আমি যেটা আগেই বলেছি, আমি না trying to generalize and give it to you in points. I'm not going to go into any details by saying which reformer did what. And this you will find in your textbook. I'm trying to approach it in a very different fashion. Number 1, reform andolon, reform movements were basically concentrated in 4 areas of India. 4 areas. The 3 presidencies, Bengal, Bombay and Madras, and the Punjab. এর বাইরে খুব কম এলাকাই আছে যেখানে রিফর্ম আন্দোলনে কোনো ইম্প্যাক্ট পড়েছিল। যে জায়গাগুলো ব্রিটিশ ইন্ডিয়ার বাইরে, যেমন কিছু নেটিভ স্টেট ছিল, আপনারা জানেন, ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্ট প্রিন্সলি স্টেট ছিল, যেমন বরোদা, ইন্দোর, কাশ্মীর ইত্যাদি। এদের কথা আমি বলছি না, এদের কথা বলতে গেলে অন্য ইতিহাসে চলে যাই। ব্রিটিশ ইন্ডিয়ার মধ্যে এই 4টে এলাকা, the 4 areas which were primarily focused on Hindu reform movement, social and religious. Number 2, there were 2 primary agendas, primary targets or primary questions within reform movement. What were these questions? Number 1, the question concerning the woman. And second, the question concerning caste. নারী জাতির উত্থানকে নিয়ে যত প্রশ্ন এবং জাতিবাদের বিরুদ্ধে যা প্রশ্ন, এই দুটি হচ্ছে মুখ্য এজেন্ডা ইন দি এন্টায়ার রিফর্ম মুভমেন্ট। এর বাইরে খুবই কম জিনিস ছিল যেগুলোর কথা বলা যায়, এবং আমাদের কাছে এত তথ্যও নেই, নো ফ্যাক্টস রিয়েলি টু স্পিক অ্যাবাউট উইদাউট মেনশনিং দিস 2 প্রিন্সিপাল এরিয়াস অফ রিফর্ম মুভমেন্টস। Number 3, reform movements were of 2 kinds. Number 1, those movements which were created and led by upper classes, upper castes. Upper classes usually were also upper castes. And another kind of movement which were led by both upper castes and classes, but also lower castes and classes. এই ডিস্টিংশনটা অনেকেই জানেন না বা আমাদের টেক্সট বুকরা বোধ করেন না। The first model, reform created by upper castes and classes and directed by upper castes, is typically seen in the case of Bengal. In other areas, in Madras and Bombay, the situation was different, in the sense that in both Madras and Bombay presidencies, you both had upper caste leaders and lower caste leaders. Take the case of Maharashtra. In Maharashtra, you hear the name of Jyotiba Phule and his wife Savitribai. Now, Phule and Savitribai were lower caste Dalit people, but they were immensely involved in social reform movement. They were the leaders, one of the two important leaders of the Maharashtrian movement against caste. So while there were upper caste leaders like Bhandarkar, Gokhale, and Tilak and Ranade in Maharashtra also carrying out reform, there were these low caste individuals also who tried to protest against caste. This you will not find in Bengal. The point I'm making here is this, and which is an interesting point. The Bengal reform movement was not only led by upper castes and classes, but it also focused almost exclusively on the woman question, not the caste question. I mean, in almost the entire 19th century, you don't really find caste-related reform movements beginning in Bengal. They were all concerned around the question of how to improve the status of the woman, how to educate her, how to make her a good housewife, how to teach her modern things. And I'm very happy to say here that, even before Britain produced her own female graduates, we had them here. And people like Kadambini Ganguly were graduates much before British ladies became graduates. So this is an awesome, a wonderful thing to experience in a country like India. But this is not to forget the fact that in Bengal, the entire reform movement had two important qualities. And we are primarily concerned with Bengal here because that is the province which you most read about. Number one, it was led by upper castes. This is the first. Number two, it was almost exclusively related to the woman question. And third, this is interesting, because it was led by upper castes and classes and related to the woman question, it relied much more on the use of religion and scripture. I mean, রামমোহন থেকে আরম্ভ করে বিদ্যাসাগর অবধি শাস্ত্রর রেফারেন্সেই সবসময় রিফর্ম মুভমেন্ট চালানো হতো। শাস্ত্রে যদি সমর্থন না থাকে তাহলে সতীপ্রথাও নিবারণ করা যেত না, আর বিধবাদের বিয়ে দেওয়া যেত না। এইটা কিন্তু this is not true of the Punjab, Madras or Bombay. So Bengal was much more concerned with what the Shastras had to say. And even people, common people, would not have been convinced that indeed Hindu widows could remarry because the Shastras said it. It was Vidyasagar who proved to them that there was a man called Parashar who said that widows, of course, they can marry. And many Shastras said that Sati Pratha was wrong. So without the sanction of the Shastras, reform in Bengal would have been very, very difficult. My last point here is this, related to this question. If there was no support from the Shastras, let me also tell you, even the British government would not have carried out the law against sati or enabled widows to marry. Because why? They would have feared rebellion. I mean, William Bentinck, when he abolished sati in 1829, made sure through Ram Mohan Roy that the Hindu Shastras supported the abolition of sati. And he very clearly says that if he knew that the abolition of sati would bring about a political rebellion against British rule, he would not have done it. So this is a very clear, pragmatic policy that the British adopted. Of course, they wanted to reform, and they wanted to reform and improve and regulate in the society. But their first concern was with their empire. Sati is not important to them as their own rule over India is. So the point I'm making here is this: both Vidyasagar and Ramohan were able to convince the British for enabling widows to marry or abolish sati because they found backing from the Shastras. Without that, I don't think even the British would have agreed to carry out with this reform. Let me give you an example to prove this. Vidyasagar attempted two things: widow marriages, and second, the abolition of Kulinism. You know about Kulinism. Let me not say very much here. But did you know that the British government refused to abolish Kulin system, saying that they did not find adequate support in the Shastras for this. So the overall attitude of the British government was play it safe. As long as there was no imminent danger from a popular political rebellion against British rule, reform was fine. But if there was some danger, they would not have attempted it. So recourse to Shastra was important. Okay, let me ask the organizers here, how much more time do I have? Sorry, no one heard me? How much time do I have left? Okay, in that case, since I don't hear anything, let me quickly wind this up by adding a few more points, and then we can have questions and answers. What was the impact that the social religious reform movements made overall on 19th century Hindu society? Number one, to repeat a point that I made at the very beginning, it made Hinduism a real historical reality. For the first time, Hindus were given to believe that there was something called Hinduism, which, as I said, wasn't the case even 100 years back. Number two, in the case of India, the intervention of the state was crucial. Without the support of the state, many things could not have happened. But this was a problem in itself because there were many people who said that why do the Hindus have to rely on laws made by the British? The British are not Hindus. Why are they interfering in our society? So this is a problem which came back again and again with the Hindus and drew up a considerable opposition. সংস্কার আন্দোলনের প্রতি বিরোধ ভাব তীব্রভাবে জাগিয়েছিল এই প্রশ্নটি যে এই যে আইন পাশ টাস হচ্ছে, এই আইন তো হিন্দুরা করছেন না, করছেন তো খ্রিশ্চানরা। তাদের কি অধিকার আছে আমাদের সামাজিক এবং ধর্মীয় জীবনে হস্তক্ষেপ করার? Number two, social religious reform movement made, and I think I want to emphasize this, made Hinduism also a global religion. একটি বিশ্বব্যাপী ধর্মের রূপ নিল এবং as we all know, this began with Vivekananda. I mean, had the social religious reform movement not taken place, Vivekananda would not have made that speech at Chicago in the World Parliament of Religions. What I'm trying to say is the following, that first, there was the effort to make Hinduism a reality. People tried to argue that there was something called Hinduism which every Hindu followed. This is a big presumption even today, as we know that even now in 2023, not all Hindus are alike. And yet, we believe that we are all Hindus in terms of faith. So this is a definition that we all somehow rightly or wrongly follow. This happened in the 19th century. And following that, number two, Hinduism became a global religion in the sense that it became a religion which other cultures, civilizations began to take note of. For the first time, let me tell you, and this is a point that, on which I shall try and end. For the first time, Hinduism became a proselytizing religion. That is, it became a religion which also tried to teach and to preach to other cultures. Please remember that traditionally, and this is, never forget this point, traditionally, you were a Hindu only if you were born a Hindu. Please underline that. You could not adopt Hinduism. Like you can convert a non-Hindu into Hinduism or a non-Muslim into Islam. That did not happen with Hinduism. You could convert a man into Islam or Christianity because both Islam and Christianity believed in preaching and conversion. Hinduism did not. But in the 19th century, by the 1880s and 1890s, even this began to appear with the Hindus. You would have heard again of the Arya Samaj. By the 1890s, the Arya Samaj started two movements called Shuddhi and Sangathan. What did they do? They tried to win back Hindus who had been converted to Islam and Christianity, to reclaim them, getting them back into Hinduism. This is extraordinary because this had never been done. So in all, Hinduism became very untypically a religion which also tries to have converts and convince other people to the superiority of Hinduism. This happened after the 1890s, beginning with Vivekananda. So as I said, and this is the point that I'm concluding on, the social religious reform movement not only made Hinduism a historical reality, they also made Hinduism a world religion. People had heard about Hindus earlier, they had known of Hindus, but they did not consider Hinduism to be a living reality and a religion which could suggest certain ideas and certain practices for other people to follow. We know now that in America and in Europe, there are people who are converting to Hinduism. Yoga and the guru culture in the West is a major phenomenon now. And thanks again to the World Parliament of Religions. In 1893, the rest of the world, perhaps the first time, heard from a Hindu what Hinduism was. And from then onwards, they've never looked back. Thank you. I'll end there. Hello? Is someone listening?
Now I am request Professor Dr. Ranjini Basu and Professor Mahmood Alam conduct the question answer session.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. আমি রঞ্জিনী বসু from Department of Philosophy. কতগুলো প্রশ্ন হ্যাঁ স্যার, কতগুলো প্রশ্ন এসেছে, আমি আপনাকে জিজ্ঞেস করছি, সেই প্রশ্নগুলো আপনাকে বলছি। প্রথম প্রশ্ন যেটা এসেছে সেটা whether Sufism or Islam had any influence in the reform movement. Sufism or Islam had any influence in the reform movement.
Okay. The answer is no. Sufism certainly affected and influenced Hinduism in the medieval era. There is a theory propounded by a Bangladeshi historian called Inamul Haq, which says that Vaishnavism was the product of Sufi impact on Bengal. Now, whether it's true or false is not really my question. The answer to that question, that in modern India, Sufism has simply no impact on the Hindu reform movement, in the sense that the Hindus did not sort of bother, especially, to think about Islam or Sufism in particular in trying to advance their reform campaign. However, I must also add here that the reform movement produced people like Keshav Chandra Sen, as you know, he was a Brahmo leader, who studied Islam, who encouraged Hindus to study Islam. And as we know, one of his followers called Girish Chandra Sen wrote a biography of Muhammad. So there were people who were interested in learning more about Islam and Muslims, but I don't think it made a direct impact on the reform movement.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is, why did the Hindu upper caste leaders depend on Shastras when the leaders of Bombay and Madras did not?
I think I need to clarify. First point here is, it is not as though leaders of Bombay and Madras did not rely on Shastras, but the lead in using Shastras had already been taken by Bengalis. That's the point I'm making. I mean, Ramon and Vidyasagar did this much earlier than the Bombay or the Madras reformers. So they already had a working model before them to act upon. In my book on Vidyasagar, I made this point that somehow the methodology of the Bombay reformers was different from that of Bengal, whereas Vidyasagar relied exclusively on Parashur to support the widow remarriage campaign. A man like Ranade relied on far more Shastras. He was able to show that there are many more texts apart from Parashur which supported widow remarriage movement. Also remember that in Maharashtra, unlike Bengal, widow remarriages were sanctioned by the Peshwas. See, under the Peshwas, widow remarriage was possible even for Hindus, upper caste Hindus, if they paid a fee. So they did not really have to gather the support of Shastras to prove the point as much as the Hindus of Bengal had. The other point that I want to add here is this, that Shastras came into play when an appeal to compassion, to Daya, both in Ramon's case and in Vidyasagar's case, their first initial movement was to appeal to people, to say that, look, Sati Pratha was bad and the widows were so badly off, Hindu widows, that they ought to be given a chance to remarry. But the appeal to Daya failed. And when the appeal to Daya, public compassion, failed, they had no other option but to turn to Shastras. This was not the case in Bombay and Madras. That is the point I'm making. It was a strategic choice. If you wanted the reform, you had to appeal to the Shastras. There was no other way. And as I also added, the British government would not have agreed to reform as readily had it not been for supporting the Shastras. Because then they would easily say, look, your own Shastras are supporting reform. Why are you blaming it on us? That's the point.
Okay, sir. I hope the answer is clear to everybody. It is clear to me. এর পরের প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে as concepts and movements for any and every kind of reforms, including God created the world, has been initiated by human beings for self-satisfaction and advantages. Are man and God the same entity?
Well, the answer to that is that in one school of Hindu philosophy, man and God are the same. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. This is what the Advaita Vedanta would say. So, I mean, Ranjini surely would know this.
Yes.
They don't make a distinction between God and man. Ultimately, of course, there is a difference to begin with. But through sadhana and through practice, you merge yourself with the oversoul, the Paramatma. So at least in one school of philosophy, there is really no difference.
The last question, sir, is why did the reform movement centered among upper caste or upper class in Bengal?
Well, I think for two reasons. Firstly, the issues related to reform in Bengal basically concerned upper castes. I mean, widow remarriage was an upper caste question. Lower caste widows always married. You should know that widow remarriages among lower castes was always a practice. The real problem was with the upper castes. And interestingly, by the close of the 19th century, the opposite happened, which is that even the lower castes stopped marrying their widows. This is called Sanskritization, which is to say that the lower castes started imitating the upper castes because of the fact that they wanted to be raised higher in social hierarchy. You should also know that lower castes stopped eating beef. They used to eat beef, they stopped eating that because that again would place them higher in the social order. So the opposite happened in Bengal, that issues like widow remarriages was not a lower caste issue at all, which is why the upper castes had to focus on it. And number two, this is related to the fact that Bengal was focusing on the woman question, not the caste question. See, the caste question assumed importance because of the lower caste rebellion against upper class victimization. Where in Bengal have you heard, or when in Bengal have you heard of lower caste leaders like Phule and Savitribai or Periyar in South India? These are lower caste leaders who are trying to radically overthrow the upper caste dominance and hegemony. And that makes sense. In Bengal, the caste question was never as important. And as I am trying to say now, the very opposite happened in Bengal, that instead of rebelling against the upper caste, the lower caste started imitating them. Upper caste rebellion in Bengal happened only in the early 20th century, around the Swadeshi period. You hear of the Motuas, for example, in parts of East Bengal. The Jugis and the Koibortos and all, they are also trying to organize themselves into movements. But that is a much later phenomenon. This doesn't really happen in the 19th century.
Okay. I think that's all for today. We do not have any more questions. Now I would like to request Dr. Shutapa Mukhopadhyay from Department of History to give the vote of thanks.
Now we are at the end of the session. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of our Departments of History and Philosophy of Kishore, Bharati, Bhagini, Nivedita College, to extend my sincere thanks to today's speaker, Professor Amiya Prosad Sen. Today we had the opportunity to hear your thoughts, sir, which have enlightened our minds and have shown us a new path. A special mention to our respected principal, sir, Dr. Shib Sankar Sana, for being the catalyst that stimulated us to organize the seminar. With a deep sense of appreciation, we thank our IQAC coordinator, Professor Mohananda Roy, for staying with us in all programs organized by the departments. Our sincere gratitude goes out to all our colleagues for their support. We heartily thank our students for their involvement in this program. Our heartfelt thanks to all the participants whose presence makes the event a grand success and a memorable one. Thank you once again. Thanks to all. The session ends here.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.